All right, welcome in. This is going to be the first edition of what Alex, Jensen, and I, Juicy, hope to make a more running podcast here at Prospects Live. What we're calling this podcast is Long and Foul because that seems like it's right down our alley. But anyways, the inaugural podcast. This is it, man. We're gonna talk about a blockbuster deal that went down today between the Mariners and the Padres. Rumors were circulating all day. Austin Nola, he had been traded. Don't know who it's going to be for. At one point, it became a highly regarded prospect as in return. And then all of the sudden, this thing just kind of blew up. 7 players in this deal. We're talking about Austin Adams, a big-time reliever, right-hander from the Mariners. Dan Altavilla, same type of profile, power, fastball, slider reliever going to the Padres, as well as Austin Nola, who bit of a Swiss Army knife, primary catcher, can play second base, left field, third base, first base, really anywhere you want. 5 years of control there. And in return, the Mariners are getting top 100, top 60 prospect outfielder Taylor Trammell. Could be a center fielder, could be a left fielder. That's to be determined at this point, obviously. As well as Louise Torrance. They're getting Andres Munoz. And they're also getting Ty France, who is a third base left field type who absolutely just murdered the baseball in minor leagues last year. So, Alex, I'm just going to throw it over to you, man. What are your first thoughts? What are your initial impressions?
I think my first thought was it just feels so natural for AJ Preller to be making a deal with Jerry Dipoto. The two guys who trade the most, they kind of done it the same way where they built up to win now and then sold off to win later. And now Preller's starting to get back to that win now. It just feels right to see two GMs that are so similar to each other make a deal finally.
Yeah, these guys, Preller's a wheeler and dealer. As we know, Jerry Dipoto loves to hit the red button and send people on their way. Let's talk about the headliner here. Let's talk about Taylor Trammell coming from the San Diego Padres over to the Seattle Mariners. He was, of course, involved in a deal last year, acquired from, was it the Reds, I think, where he came over in another deal, another big deal. So what are your thoughts on Trammell, and what are your thoughts on just what is effectively turned into the deepest, maybe most impressive outfield prospect class that I've ever seen in minor league baseball? Maybe I'm overselling that, but 3 guys in the top 60, 2 in the top 20. This is unbelievable for the Mariners.
It's a pretty ridiculous, especially in the outfield class right now. And I think that's huge. You're always going to have guys in the outfield going down with injury. You're always going to have guys, and we don't know who it is. I hope all of them succeed amazingly, but chances are at least 1 or 2 players aren't going to fully pan out to what we think they can be. And we kind of saw it reverse of this with Kyle Lewis this year, where out of nowhere, he was just a totally different player from last year to this year. And usually there's going to be some that go the other way. It's not always linear. So it's just exciting to get a bunch of good guys in the building and let it get figured out. I'm a big fan of Trammell. He's a tremendous athlete. He's a really patient hitter. And from what it sounded like, he was the guy who could be, optimized in order to get better results. And it sounded like they were starting to tap into that last year. So, considering how progressive our player development is, I'm pretty excited to see what happens there. And at the end of the day, there's a saying at Prospects Live, always bet on the athlete. And you don't get too many better athletes to bet on than Taylor Trammell.
Yeah, that's a huge philosophy of mine. It's why I criticized the organization a little bit at the draft. They didn't go after athleticism as much. But this is different. They're trading they're trading kind of relievers, and they're trading Austin Nola, who's got versatility, for stuff. Andres Munoz is a monster reliever. You're talking about a guy that is 98 to 100. He's touched 103 in the past. He immediately steps in with what I would imagine would be Yohan Ramirez as the 7th, 8th, 9th inning guy. The fastball, when he can spot it, it's effectively wild at times, but when he can spot it, especially at the top of the zone, it is effectively unhittable. We're talking about at bare minimum, it's a 70 grade heater. It could be an 80 grade heater if he rolls in the command. He's got a slider that he's been working on over the past few years that it's fine. It has more depth than it has run. It's generally in the mid 80s, but at this point, it's a good, get me over pitch when he can spot that as well. Here's the thing about Munoz. I mean, you've been watching him for a long time, like I have. The dude has never posted an ERA over 4 in his professional stateside career. Like, he's not hit by guys that aren't at the big league level. And, he sputtered a little bit at the big league level, but tell me a little bit about your thoughts of adding Trammell to this, what we can now call kind of a burgeoning bullpen of big arms.
Yeah. So with Munoz, I think, there's a lot of guys that throw hard, but there aren't that many guys that have truly rare, like you can't get this kind of tool stuff. And Munoz is one of those guys. And I think especially considering, like you mentioned, the never having area above 4 in any minor league stop, that was while he was pitching against guys who are much older than him most of the time. He's been playing above his age. So it's really exciting to see a guy who's doing that before he's worked out the kinks, and makes you really excited for what can happen once he works out those kinks. Because as deep as this Mariners, and I noticed this making their top 30 list, they have a lot of interesting bullpen arms. And there's going to be a big wave of those guys coming up, and they can figure out who some of those guys are that are going to be rounding that out. But there aren't too many guys who have that true closer upside, and I think Munoz is one of those guys.
Yeah, it seems like Jerry Dipoto has kind of been betting on that arm for a little bit now with Johan Ramirez in the Rule 5 draft, and now Munoz. Raymond Kerr is on his way up, and then it hasn't been as smooth as you'd like for Joey Gerber and Aaron Fletcher, but they've got some young, controllable dudes with stuff, and so it'll be an interesting bullpen to watch and kind of feel out over the next year and a half for Seattle. I want to talk a little bit about Ty France, because anybody that follows Mariners Twitter at this point, they're familiar with France. The dude hit 399 last year in minor league ball. I don't have the amount of home runs that he hit in front of me, but it was a ton of home runs. What are your thoughts on me? I mean, I'm assuming France slots right into the game plan at the big league level in some regard. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking he's one of those guys that just about everybody is like, just get this guy some at-bats. And when they traded for one of my personal favorite players recently, it kind of really took away any chance that he was going to have to get those at-bats on that infield. So he's just a guy where I'm excited to, see what's real and what's not. He's kind of been up and down, in the pros, but so far, even this year, he limited at-bats for sure, small sample size, just 51 at-bats, but he's slashing 314, 375, 510. And if that kind of, stat line can stay up, or even just that stat line, hitting in a platoon role, that's super valuable. And, when you get guys that just perform and perform and perform, and you just can't find ways to get at-bats, it's fun to see them go to an org where they can get those at-bats, and you find out if you actually have a rough gem.
Yeah, and I would say, Ty France probably effectively fills the Austin Nola role, right? He's going to play second base. He's going to play third base. He's going to play left field. Obviously, he's not going to play behind the plate. So that's going to be something that the Mariners are going to have to figure out. I mean, Cal Raleigh is probably, if you're doing this the right way, he's probably a year and a half away. I wouldn't play him this year. I wouldn't play him next year, but, we'll see. So that's where Louise Torrance kind of steps in. He's been a big league backup. He's not the kind of guy that's going to put up big slash lines or anything like that, but he effectively fills a role that Seattle doesn't have. I mean, Joe Odom and Joe Hudson, neither one of them had even really played at the big league level up until this year. So that's something that Torrance does have. He does not have prospect status anymore with 140 at-bats, so you won't, see his name on prospect lists or anything. Do you have anything that you want to add as far as where Louise Torrance fits in, or is he just kind of, a pawn in that regard?
Yes, I do. But before I get into that, I just want to touch in. I had to look it up since you were talking about Ty France stats. And in AAA last year, in 76 games, he managed to slug 27 home runs with 27 doubles. So if we're counting, that would be on pace for, on a 162 game pace, more than 110 extra base hits, which is, I don't even know what to say to that. That's pretty absurd.
I mean, with Ty France, that's not the player that he's going to be. Like you hope that he's like a 275, 280 hitter who can run into, 15 to 18 home runs, maybe 20 home runs at the big league level over 110 games. I don't necessarily know if he's a full-time regular on a championship team, but he is the Austin Nola piece utility guy that you really need on your team, and he's a reliable bat. He's very similar in that regard to someone like a Michael Chavis or who's the guy, Austin Riley. He's kind of like Austin Riley in that same vein. So yeah, he's going to be a really fun piece to watch and develop, and he's got 6 years of controllability. So yeah, I mean, we've been pounding the table for Ty France blocked by Manny Machado to get to Seattle at some point, and we spoke it into
it.
So here we go. Well, hey, tell me a little bit about Louise Torrance. What should fans expect, and kind of what's his big league role going to be?
So Louise Torrance, I remember as a guy who, when he first came out, he had some hype as a top 100 prospect. I don't remember if he ever truly made a list, but I do remember him getting talked about quite a bit. So he's not some guy that's been a nobody, and the dude's only 23 years old. It feels like he's been around forever because he was such kind of a recognizable name since he was about 17 years old. But right. Dude's only 23. Like, he'd still be young for AA right now, or at least, average age. And fittingly, last year, the bat came around finally. With him, it was always the tale of he's a great defensive catcher. He knows how to call a game, and the bat just didn't work out like it's supposed to. Well, last year, admittedly, at an age where he was just only slightly below average age for the level and in a bit of a hitter's park in Amarillo, but he had over 300, 373 on base percentage, 500 slugging percentage. So it really started to come around. And if you get even average offensive, outperformance for a catcher from him with his defense, that's a really valuable player, especially as a backup and someone that can spell a guy like Raleigh, who I know the organization is super high on, and I know is just a super, super undervalued player as someone who studies tape and just figures out how to get hitters out. Like, if you ever watch some of the splits on Mariners pitchers when they're with him as their catcher, it's just absurd. The dude really studies the game. So I'm excited for him. But, I mean, being able to have those two guys who can add that value and you can rest, that's really exciting. And, I mean, the price is so reasonable.
Yeah. And, and that's something that Seattle has been lacking. They've been lacking a defense-first catcher. Austin Nola is incredible, largely an offensive first guy. I mean, he didn't even really catch for the team last year unless it was in a pinch. Joe Odom has been, labeled as a defensive first guy. He's had some struggles back there with pass balls this year, but still he looks like that quad A guy that's going to be a good defensive catcher. And then Joe Hudson, we don't really know what we have with Joe Hudson. I mean, he was a minor league signing this past year. He's still kind of feeling his way through the organization after being with, I believe it was St. Louis for a number of years. Well, hey, I want to kind of jump in last couple of points here. This really kind of changes, in my opinion, the narrative of maybe minor league farm rankings and kind of where Seattle falls. This gives them, for the time being, 6 top 60 players in the top 100 with George Kirby and Noelvi Marte in that top 110 range. Still don't think they're at the level of Tampa Bay, but for my money, Seattle is the second best farm in the league now. No?
I think you can make a strong case for probably 3 teams right now. I think the Padres, as much as they've just sold off, they still have a super, super deep farm system. But I mean, when you're talking about top end talent, it's right there for the Mariners. And most excitingly, I think, has been the fact that we're starting to turn players into dudes in our system. And when you're able to bring in talent and you're able to develop talent, that's when you start to see stuff really pan out. And I think for me, the biggest thing here is with the amount of depth we have with high-end outfield prospects, if we are able to start to compete in, say, 2022, 2023, all of a sudden you have movable trade chips that will fetch an actual return at a position of need. So I'm excited for that personally.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we haven't mentioned here, just because, Trammell, Kelenic, Fraley, Rodriguez, Kyle Lewis, there's a lot of guys vying for time out there. Mitch Haniger. He's going into ARB2 this year. He's probably going to be due, $6 million, $7 million. That's just me spitballing. It could be a little less. It could be a little more. I think he's making like $4 million this year. Suddenly, the organization has a little bit of a decision to make there. I won't, have you comment on that or anything like that. But it's an interesting dilemma. It's probably a good problem to have if you're the Mariners. But yeah, big things coming. I think the Padres, kind of circling back to the Padres, because they got the big league talent here. They got remarkably better. That bullpen is. Listen, Austin Adams for me. I said this preseason as we were kind of loading into the year. For me, I think he's a top 15 reliever in the game. And I know that that's really loud for a lot of people because he hasn't thrown that many innings, but he's got some of the best raw stuff. He's got a 3,100 RPM slider that he dots. And he's got a fastball that's 95 to 97 with insane ride and run. So, he has been throwing off the mound for Seattle. He is yet to be activated, but he's going to slot right into that bullpen as a high leverage guy who can get strikeouts just to add to the innumerable arms that they throw at you from that bullpen. And then Dan Altavilla, hey man, he was with the team for 4 or 5 years. He never quite made it click, but he's in the same conversation as Austin Adams in that the fastball spin is high, the slider spin is high, the spin efficiency on his slider is poor. He throws frisbees at times, but you're talking about two really good arms that the Padres could, lean on here in a postseason run. And then, of course, Austin Nola, who he can play absolutely anywhere, especially for a team that's had its struggles at catcher. So it's a good trade all the way around. I think Seattle got better in the long term. I think the Padres really leaned into their farm system to make a hard push for a World Series championship this year, and it should be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I think there hasn't been a single team in the history of baseball that said, we have too many relievers this year. So it's always helpful to have that test because guys are going to go down. Yep.
Well, that's all we got. You'll be seeing more of Alex and I in the coming days and weeks and months as we're going to try to have this long and foul podcast become more of a little quick hitter here and there. But Alex, it's always fun, man. Always fun catching up. We catch you guys next time, and have a good night. Peace.
Likewise.